Here's the scenario. You've got your first chameleon, it's going great, you love it, and you're thinking, what could be better than getting another chameleon? Well, I absolutely love chameleons, and so I'm not going to argue with you on that one. But like everything, a little bit of planning goes a long way to make sure you do it right and you retain that level of enjoyment that you have right now. So I'm going to go over 3 items to consider that will make adding another chameleon to your household the enjoyable experience you think it will be. My name is Bill Strand, and this is the Chameleon Academy. Before we go into those 3 things to consider before you get another chameleon, there are 2 prerequisites. The first is that you evaluate the husbandry for the chameleon you have already. Before you get another chameleon, you want to make sure that that husbandry is as good as possible. Are there things that you can do to make your present husbandry better? Can you add an automated misting system, a fogger, live plants, a larger cage? All of these things establish the baseline for the kind of husbandry that you can provide. The first thing that you should be doing is working on what your husbandry is going to be that's going to represent you and, of course, give your chameleon the best life possible. Make that husbandry as excellent as possible. Make it Instagram worthy. And then, when you bring on another chameleon, make sure it comes on at that same level. The second prerequisite is that this new chameleon is going to have their own cage. Do not keep chameleons together. Not temporarily, not because they're brother and sister, not because they've been raised together, not because they're male and female, not because they're baby, adult, juvenile. There's all sorts of exceptions that people have tried to make over the years, but none of them hold. Chameleons should be together only for mating and then to their own cages. So do not get another chameleon until you have a complete separate setup. Okay, with those 2 prerequisites out of the way, let's go into the 3 things to consider when you're looking at getting another chameleon. The first is to leverage what you've already set up. What this means is, if you've got a setup that you've optimized to make a panther chameleon happy, the first chameleons you should be considering are the kind of chameleons that live in the same situation as a panther chameleon would. Leverage what you've already set up. For example, if you like Jackson's chameleons, I would say you have good taste because they're one of my favorites. But the thing about Jackson's chameleons is they need a deep nighttime drop. In temperature, I mean. And although a cold night is okay and sometimes beneficial for a panther, they are not as dependent upon it as a Jackson's. So often panther chameleon keepers don't have a nighttime temperature drop. At least not a deliberate one into the low 60s, high 50s. And so if you have a very happy panther chameleon and then put a Jackson's chameleon in a cage right next to that panther chameleon, but don't give that nighttime drop, your Jackson's chameleon will end up getting sick over the months. You'll have a perfectly happy panther chameleon and a sick and on its way to dying Jackson's chameleon. And so what I'm saying is do research on the conditions that this new chameleon you're interested in takes. If you have a panther chameleon and you want a Jackson's chameleon, for example, then perhaps you need a separate room that has an air conditioner. Or else, check out the species that will do well in the same conditions as a panther chameleon. For example, a carpet chameleon would do well. Now, if you're taking advantage of your current infrastructure and supply chain, you need to take into account that with the carpet chameleon, you'll need to get smaller food. So you'll have to have 2 types of food that you bring in, a larger for the panther and a smaller for the carpet. If you wanted to become more optimized, well then look at the Furcifer ustuleti or Furcifer varicosus, which will do well in panther chameleon conditions and will eat the same size food. And yes, I am using the scientific name because when you start getting into all these different species of chameleons, it is useful to be able to use a scientific name because we really only use the common name for the 5 most popular chameleons. And you don't want to limit yourself to those chameleons if you're looking for one that will live in a specific climate. Now, it does get easier. If you love panther chameleons, you can consider getting a different panther chameleon. There's so many different locales of panther chameleon, and the female is actually, it looks different than the male, and so you could consider that a different kind of chameleon. But of course, they all take the same conditions as the panther that you have right now. In fact, I know some of my friends, they just do panther chameleons And over the years, they add on another locale of panther chameleon. So they have the blues and then they have the yellows, and it's a lot of fun. The advantage in that is that everyone that they bring into their home takes the same conditions as they have already set up. So my advice is to make it easy for yourself, or else be willing to do the research and put in the extra infrastructure if you want to venture beyond the environment of the chameleon that you have already. The second item I'd like you to consider is beware of number creep. And what I mean by that is adding another cage and another chameleon is not going to take that much more time to take care of it. You took care of the hardest things when you set up for the first chameleon. The problem with this is you add a second one and that wasn't a whole lot more work. Then you add a third one and, well, that wasn't a whole lot more work than it was to take care of two. And then you add a fourth one and it just keeps going and going until you finally take a look at your life and you realize you're working so hard to take care of all the chameleons that you don't have time to enjoy your chameleons. This is the number creep that I'm talking about. And it's so easy for us in the chameleon community and actually the reptile community to fall into. Because every new one is just a small increment. But when you add it all up together, it adds up to something that's pretty significant. And so my second piece of advice is try to put aside your excitement for this new chameleon, put that aside for a minute and say, all right, what do I need to do to make sure that the workload is not going to exceed my enjoyment? And once again, I say this because it's happened to me. I have let this happen to me. And it's a horrible feeling when you step back and you realize, hey, what happened? How come I'm not enjoying this as much? And it's not that I don't enjoy chameleons. It's I am working so hard that I get so tired that I'm not able to actually enjoy the chameleons. When you have to go from cage to cage to clean, you feed, and you're taking care of each cage, and it takes up all the extra time you don't have time to sit back, enjoy the chameleons, watch the chameleons, hand feed the chameleons, all the fun things that you can do now. And please, take it from me, from my experience, it creeps up slowly. You don't notice the time as it slowly adds until you find yourself in a bad situation. So please learn from my experience and don't repeat that mistake. Looking back over the decades that I've kept chameleons, I will tell you the truth. You get more fulfillment and satisfaction for having a couple of chameleons in the ultimate husbandry than you do having a whole collection of chameleons in the minimum that keeps them alive. And you can carve that in stone. All right, the third piece of advice is beware of breeding. I know, once you have the perfect first chameleon, many times our thoughts go to, hey, I can get another chameleon that's a female and then I can breed. Not only will that be a lot of fun, but I can sell the babies and I can pay for my hobby. Isn't that a great package deal? And on the surface, yes, it's a great package deal. Breeding chameleons is a great experience. It's a learning experience. And I got to tell you, one of my favorite pastimes in my life is hatching out baby chameleons and raising them up. But take it from a guy who loves doing that. Here are the things you have to prepare to make sure it doesn't become a nightmare. And I have seen it become a nightmare for so many people because they haven't planned properly. First, chameleons need to be kept separately. That is just the nature of a chameleon. I know we have in the past, we've raised them together. That has always been improper husbandry. We've gotten away with it because we've figured out how to mitigate the problems, but those chameleons are under stress. That's not the right way to do it. And if you are going to go into breeding, commit to yourself and the chameleons that you're going to do it right. That means each chameleon is raised in a separate cage. And what that means is you need to put in the appropriate infrastructure. And if you look at your typical panther chameleon, they have between 20 and 30 eggs. That's 20 to 30 cages. That's a lot to set up. Now, you don't have to do it professionally where you spend $200 a cage. You can do something like buy $10 butterfly cages. They aren't the best, but they work. And if you're just looking for the experience, you're not looking to invest thousands upon thousands of dollars into the infrastructure. But you are going to need lights, UVB, you're going to need misting type systems. Even if you do it by hand, you're going to have to budget out for the amount of time to do that. The point is that you want to spend all that time that the eggs are incubating to build out the infrastructure so you can take care of those babies in the best way possible. Now, I know you're going to be saying, yeah, but people have been raised them before, so I should be able to do that. That's a trap. If you are going to be doing an improper husbandry, there's a reason why it's improper. It's because the babies get stressed when you do that. And the weakest in the clutch are not going to be eating as much as the strongest, and they'll get sick, and you won't be able to monitor their health. And so you're going to have to deal with the weaker of the chameleons maybe not making it. And since chameleons are not social, they oftentimes will start getting physical with each other, which means you may have bite marks, you may have nipped tails. All of this not only is it traumatic for the chameleons themselves, but it is stressful for you, especially if you plan to sell them at 3 months old and you find out the second thing that I want to say about breeding, it is hard to sell chameleons. Yes, I know you see the established breeders and they're selling these chameleons for $300, $500 each. My goodness, you can make some good money like that. The problem is they're not selling every chameleon at that amount. In fact, they're not selling every chameleon. If you're doing panther chameleons, everybody wants that brightly colored male, right? What do you do about the females? Yeah, they don't sell nearly as quickly as the males. And you see the best looking male studs that they have, right? Well, how about the ones that aren't that colorful? And if this is your first time breeding, you don't have that marketing. You don't have that reputation. So why would they buy from you? Selling chameleons is a job on its own, and it's not easy. It can be done, but if you want to make sure this doesn't become a nightmare, make sure you're able to house these baby chameleons for 3 to 6 months. And that means lots of larger cages. If you keep them together, especially 3 to 6 months old, you're definitely going to be having bite marks and nip tails, and that makes it even harder to sell those chameleons. I would love it if breeding chameleons was easier. Unfortunately, it's not. And if we want to breed chameleons, we have to accept what chameleons are, and they are under no obligation to make it easy for us. They evolved into what they are, and we have to take them at face value. I mean, we don't have a choice. The point is that if you want to breed or are considering breeding, make sure you go into it with a solid plan for making infrastructure and how you're going to sell the babies. Otherwise, don't get into breeding. You can spend years upon years of enjoyment keeping your chameleons without breeding. And just know, whenever you decide that you are ready to take on that experience, I mean, it's easy to do. You can at any time decide, okay, I'm ready to breed. But don't do it before you know everything that goes into building up the infrastructure and preparing for it. Those are my 3 main points, but I want to give you some perspectives from people from the community. I often take these topics that I want to make a video of, and I present it in the weekly Chameleon Academy email newsletter. And I ask for the experiences of the people in the community. Last week's newsletter had this topic, and I'd like to share some of the responses I got back from the members of the community. I asked them, what advice would you give keepers that are considering getting a second chameleon? And here's what they said. Nate Rowley wrote, for me, the biggest piece of advice that I feel very strongly for, try and plan for the backbone or infrastructure of taking care of multiple animals. Without systems and automations, you will quickly be spending so much time doing basic care, you can lose your momentum easily, and then their care will dwindle. Make sure you have your current animals dialed in and happy before considering adding any more to the mix. And this is a great point because some things that you do to take care of one are not scalable when you have 2, 3, or 4. For example, your hydration. I recommend having an automated misting system, but you can get away with doing hand misting if you have 1 chameleon. If you add another chameleon with an automated misting system, it's no problem. It just happens at the same time. But if you're hand misting, well, now you've doubled the amount of time that it takes. And often, people don't double the amount of time they spend, they just split up their time. And so your husbandry standard actually goes down when you add another chameleon. So evaluate your husbandry, and if you're adding more chameleons, you may have to add more infrastructure, we're calling it. Marsha Ipson shared, another thing to consider is what will you do if an emergency arises, such as evacuations and power outages. Maybe you can transport a chameleon or two, but what about 6 or 8? And so yes, know your area. If you're in an area that has tornadoes, hurricanes, or fires, or really, this is good for anyone, how are you going to evacuate your chameleons? The more chameleons you have, the more of a plan you need to put in place. Next, Mikey Ben says, another thing quite common is the possible stress of your spouse partner of bringing another pet in. Maybe they feel they take second place while we focus on getting the chameleon acclimated. And yes, know your partner, know where they stand. And often when we get excited about a new interest, our partner can feel perhaps left out. So take into account your spouse or partner. You know what they need. And if you feel like they may be feeling left out, perhaps giving them a little bit more attention could ease the relationship. Susan Malloy shared, also discuss the cost involved in additional animals. I take my chameleon for annual vet visits, and 2 or more will increase that cost. Obviously, consider the cost of more if something goes wrong and they have to go to the vet. Obviously, very good advice. Few people think about what happens if I have to take them to the vet and sets aside a budgeted amount of money for these vet visits, which may or may not happen. But with the more chameleons, the more chances there may be an opportunity that you have to take the chameleon to the vet. And finally, John Donahue shared a story about him breeding Jackson's chameleons. He bred his Jackson's chameleons, he got the right infrastructure, he did it right, but he found that it was difficult to sell them. He says, unfortunately, I had so many baby Xanth Jacksons, that's Jacksoni xantholophus, it's the larger Jackson's chameleon, and adults that would not sell. I decided to give them all to a friend that has a reptile shop 30 miles north of me in Texas. Now I have so much equipment in cages. So he's sharing this is a common experience. When you sell chameleons, you find that it becomes difficult to sell them. He talked a little bit about that, but what happens if you can't sell your chameleons? I've seen John over the years, and he's done a good job working with these Jackson's chameleons. In fact, I did this about 6 years ago and ran into the same wall. Jackson's chameleons are incredible chameleons, but Wild Sourced introduced Jackson's chameleons have just totally destroyed the market. It's still absolutely worth it to buy from a breeder, but because the price has been so depressed and established as so cheap, it's not sustainable. It makes it so it's difficult for legitimate breeders to actually find homes for what they produce. And so with these exotic species, you have the problem of finding these customers. For panther chameleons, you have the problem of competing with established breeders. It can be a real challenge if you want to start breeding to figure out how to do it in a way that isn't going to be more trouble than it's worth. Just an aside, if somebody came to me and said, Bill, I want to start breeding chameleons, I want that experience, what species would you recommend me working with? I would recommend starting with a carpet chameleon. Carpet chameleons are an up-and-coming species. There's a lot of demand for carpet chameleons. They're hardy, they're small, and they're wonderful chameleons. Right now, at this point in time, anybody having captive hatched carpet chameleons shouldn't have a problem selling them. Anyone with carpet chameleons has a wait list, if they take wait lists. And another advantage is that carpet chameleons are small and they have small clutches. And so you don't have to take on the burden of making 30 cages. So at this point in time, a carpet chameleon is probably the best species if you want to breed chameleons. And if you have any more questions about getting another chameleon, I have 2 weekly live sessions that I use as office hours. And so you can ask questions at those live sessions and get a live answer. The live sessions are here on YouTube, Tuesday night, 5 p.m. Pacific, and Saturday at 12 noon Pacific. Anyone is able to join. Ask a question, and let's talk about it. And I want to thank my newsletter readers that responded and allowed me to use their advice here in this video. And if you'd like to be part of this discussion and talk about these weekly topics, you're welcome to sign up for the Chameleon Academy newsletter. You'll get it in your email every week, and it's completely free. The link for signing up is going to be in the description. All right, everybody, have a great weekend. I'll see you next time.